please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks. The last place I ever expected to encounter something unexplainable was a tiny, run-down corner store. You know the kind. The kind of place that smells faintly of bleach and stale candy, wedged between a laundromat with flickering neon signs and a pawn shop that probably hadn't seen a customer in weeks. It was Christmas Eve, and instead of relaxing at home like a normal teenager, I was stuck on a late-night grocery run with my mom. I had you. To set the scene, I was 16, moody, and already counting down the minutes until I could plop on the couch with my little brother and binge-watch cheesy holiday specials. Mom had just finished a grueling shift at the diner, and apparently this grocery trip was urgent. Two things I was pretty sure no one actually needed on Christmas Eve. The store was exactly what you'd expect. Harsh fluorescent lights humming like an old radiator, aisles in a state of mild chaos, and a few shoppers who looked just as exhausted as my mom. The linoleum floor was scuffed and shiny in patches, and the whole place had a weird clinical vibe that made you want to get in and get out as fast as possible. I followed Mom through the aisles, dragging my feet and half-tuned out thanks to my earbuds. She was focused on her crumpled shopping list, muttering to herself about prices, while I grabbed a wire basket and trudged along behind her. That's when I noticed him. He was by the canned goods aisle, standing so still I almost thought he was a mannequin at first. An old man, leaning slightly on the handle of an empty shopping cart. His clothes hung off him, an oversized brown sweater with frayed cuffs and slacks that looked like they belonged to someone twice his size. He had this blank expression, like he wasn't really there, just staring, not at the shelves, but at nothing in particular. I didn't think much of it at first. Big city, weird people. It was practically a rule. I figured he was one of those harmless types who wander grocery stores just to kill time or escape the cold. And whispered, "Be careful, Brenna Marati." Then I saw him again, this time by the bread aisle. Then again, lingering near the dairy section. Each time, he wasn't doing anything. No shopping, no browsing, just standing there watching. At this point, I started feeling that little prickle at the back of my neck. You know the one, where your body tells you something's off, even if your brain isn't sure what it is yet. I shook it off, convincing myself I was overreacting. It's Christmas Eve, I thought. Maybe he's just lonely. But then it started feeling deliberate. By the time we reached the candy aisle, I was sure he was following us. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, there he was. Same empty cart, same hollow stare. I nudged my mom as she compared prices on peppermint bark. "Hey, don't look, but I think that guy is following us," I whispered. Mom glanced up briefly, barely giving him a second look before going back to her list. People just shop weird. "But don't make it a thing," she said. But it was a thing. I could feel his gaze every time we turned a corner, like a spotlight on the back of my neck. I stopped in the middle of an aisle, pretending to tie my shoe, just to see what he'd do. Sure enough, he shuffled past me, his cart squeaking softly as he moved. That's when I caught his smell, sharp and strange, like mothballs and something metallic, like pennies left out in the rain. By the time we got to the checkout line, I felt like I could finally breathe again. We were almost done. He was still there, though, lingering by the self-checkout machines, partially hidden behind a towering display of gingerbread house kits. He wasn't even pretending to shop anymore, just standing there, his empty cart beside him. Then there was nothing. Outside, the cold hit like a slap. The parking lot was almost empty, just a few other cars scattered around. Mom handed me a bag of groceries to load into the trunk while she went to unlock the car. That's when I heard it. A low, gravelly voice, rough, like sandpaper rubbed against wood. "Don't forget to leave the back door open." I whipped around, and there he was. He was standing so close I could see every deep crack and wrinkle on his face, like the surface of dried-out clay. His eyes were sunken and glassy, like he was looking straight through me. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. Before I could even process what was happening, he turned and shuffled off, disappearing into the dark edges of the parking lot. On the drive home, I told Mom everything. Every detail, from the staring to the smell to what he said. She didn't say much, just gripped the steering wheel tighter and double-checked the locks when we got home. Normally, she would have brushed it off or told me to stop scaring myself. But this time she didn't. And that scared me more than anything. The rest of the night felt off. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, and the air felt heavy, like the whole place was holding its breath. We went through the motions, wrapping presents, setting out cookies for Santa, but it didn't feel right. My little brother fell asleep on the couch around 9, curled up under a fuzzy blanket. Mom and I stayed up, pretending to watch some old Christmas special neither of us cared about. And then, at exactly 9:17, it started. 3 knocks. Sharp, deliberate. They echoed through the apartment, louder than they had any right to be. Mom and I froze, staring at each other. Then, 3 more knocks, this time from the back door. Mom grabbed the kitchen knife without a word, her face pale but determined. "Stay here," she whispered. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. As I fumbled with the phone, the lights flickered, casting the room into brief, stuttering darkness. The fridge hummed, then went silent, and then came the music. A warped, distorted version of Silent Night, like it was playing from a broken wind-up music box. The air turned icy, so cold I could see my breath hanging in front of me. The pounding started again, louder this time, rattling the walls. The doorknobs twisted violently. First one, then the other, as if someone, or something, was trying to force their way inside. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Everything went silent. When the police arrived, there was nothing to find. No footprints in the snow outside. No signs of forced entry. But there was one thing. A neatly folded brown sweater sitting on the back porch. I knew it hadn't been there before. Every Christmas Eve since, it's the same. At exactly 9:17, the knocks start. The air grows cold, the lights flicker, and that eerie music fills the air. The silence is so thick and intense, everything starts to stir. We've moved 3 times, but it doesn't matter. It always finds us. Every year, another sweater appears, colder than the last. I don't know what he wants. I don't think I ever will. But I've learned one thing. The back door stays locked, always. The first time I met Violet, it was during one of those classic college holiday fairs that make you feel like the world is glowing. The quad was alive, with twinkling lights strung between the trees. The air smelled of roasted chestnuts and spiced cider. You could hear the faint hum of carolers, singing in the distance. It was chilly, the kind of cold that bites your nose but doesn't drive you indoors. I was standing by a mulled wine stall, debating whether the tiny cup of overpriced warm wine was worth it, when I felt a presence beside me. I turned, and there she was. Agony Star. The tablet died a few hours earlier. Darkness would make the black locks white. She was bundled in a pale scarf that looked almost white in the dim glow of the lights. Her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. There wasn't anything striking about her appearance, but there was this air about her, like she'd stepped out of the background of an old memory you couldn't quite place. Familiar, but not. She smiled at me, a small, unassuming smile, and then said, with this surprising directness, "Want to grab lunch sometime?" I remember blinking, caught completely off guard. I wasn't exactly someone strangers approach with invitations like this, especially not out of the blue. But it was Christmas, and her timing made it feel harmless, maybe even a little charming. I said yes, mostly out of politeness, and because I didn't want to be the kind of person who turned down random acts of friendliness. At that moment, I thought it was just lunch. Just one lunch. I had no idea it was the start of something I'd carry with me for years to come. We started meeting up regularly after that, mostly for casual lunches on campus. At first, it felt easy, like we were just two people passing the time. She had a way of filling silences with light conversation, talking about professors, classes, or funny things she'd overheard in the dining hall. But as weeks passed, I noticed something strange. Violet wasn't just meeting me for lunch. She was always there, waiting outside my lectures, coincidentally walking in the same direction as me, or showing up at the library when I was studying. It started to feel less like coincidence and more like she was keeping track of me. As I said it, I caught Violet's gaze from a few rows away. She wasn't just looking, she was staring. Her eyes locked on me with this intensity that made my stomach twist. I looked away quickly, brushing it off. The strange thing? I'd never told her my last name. She'd spelled it perfectly, though. I told myself she must have found it in some campus directory, but it still gave me this uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. This moment is my inevitable entry into Samantha Locke's tomb. As the holidays got closer, her texts started coming more frequently. At first, they were casual, links to memes, comments on my posts. But soon, they turned into a constant stream of messages. He sent her multiple messages each day, saying, "Much love, and I miss you." She'd tag me in things without much context, like inside jokes that didn't exist. I told myself she was just overly friendly, but her behavior started to cross lines. One day, she made this offhand comment about my girlfriend Paige. "Her name's kind of basic, don't you think? For someone like you," she'd said, tilting her head like it was some innocent observation. The way she said it, though, was anything but innocent. It felt like a warning shot. Subtle but sharp. Christmas Eve was when everything changed. Most of the students had gone home for the break, but I'd stayed behind to finish a paper. That evening, Violet texted me, asking if I wanted to go for a walk. I'd already turned her down twice that week, but there was something about her tone this time, almost desperate, that made me hesitate. She suggested the chapel gardens, saying the snow and lights made it magical. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The air was freezing when I met her outside the chapel. She was wrapped in this long red coat. her breath curling into clouds as she spoke. Soft and waving. Yes. She didn't say much at first, just smiled and led me through the garden. The path was lined with evergreens, wrapped in dim, flickering fairy lights. The quiet was heavy, so still that every crunch of snow underfoot felt deafening. Satisfied, nothing mattered. She stopped suddenly by a cluster of trees and turned to me. "This place feels like a secret," she said, her voice soft, almost dreamy, like it's just for us. Before I could respond, she stepped closer, her gloved hand brushing mine. Then, without warning, she leaned in and kissed me. Her lips were ice cold, her movements rushed and urgent. I froze, pulling back instinctively. "Violet," I stammered, my voice barely steady. "I can't do this." For a moment, her face crumpled, and I thought she might cry. But then she smiled, a strange, distant smile that made my skin crawl. "It's okay," she said, her tone eerily calm. "You'll understand. One day." I didn't stick around to figure out what she meant. I turned and walked away as quickly as I could, the sound of my boots crunching against the snow echoing in the silence. When I glanced back, she was still there, standing perfectly still, framed by the faint glow of the fairy lights. That image haunted me for days. After that, things escalated. In January, I stumbled across something that turned my unease into outright fear. I was scrolling through Tumblr when I saw a post quoting my personal bio, word for word. The account belonged to Violet. Her entire blog was a bizarre, obsessive shrine dedicated to me. She'd written long, detailed posts romanticizing our lunches, calling them dates. That kiss on Christmas Eve? She'd rewritten it as a mutual confession under the stars. But the most unsettling part was the fictional character she'd created. She called him Ian, and he was a twisted version of me, idealized, perfect, and completely under her control. She'd even used my photos, reposting them as though they belonged to this made-up person. Her followers ate it up, encouraging her obsession like some kind of twisted fandom. Patriotic function, the tone in my voice, would trigger her, and Hammett was. A perfect Kingen. When I confronted her about it, she acted completely oblivious. "What blog?" she asked, her expression blank. By the next day, the blog was gone, but her behavior didn't stop. Christmas morning, I found a small gift outside my dorm room. Inside was a snow globe and a note. "To the one I'll always wait for." That was the last straw. I blocked her on every platform, but it didn't stop her. She started spreading rumors about me, flirting with Paige and trying to sabotage my friendships. The scariest part came a year later. I was living off campus by then, trying to move on. One afternoon, a card arrived in the mail. There was no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Inside, it read, "No one knows you like I do. It's been years now, and I've done everything I can to distance myself. Changed numbers, deleted accounts, even moved cities. But Violet always finds a way back. Every Christmas, I brace myself for the reminder that her obsession isn't something that fades. It lingers, like the faint scent of spiced cider, weaving itself into a season that should bring peace, but always leaves me feeling haunted." The snow crunched under my boots as I stepped off the curb. My breath formed little clouds in the freezing air. Christmas lights blinked cheerfully from windows and along rooftops. The colors bounced off the frost-covered cars parked along the street. Normally, I'd love this kind of thing. The festive decorations, the cold biting my nose, the faint scent of pine trees from the little stalls selling last-minute wreaths. And then, but that night, none of it mattered. It felt like all the warmth and cheer of the season was happening in another world, far away from the pit in my stomach. Nick had called me earlier that evening, just as I'd sat down to wrap a few gifts. My laziness? I knew it. I know it. His voice was a wreck. "Lila, it's bad," he said, barely louder than a whisper. "Really bad. I need you." I tried to get more out of him. What happened, where he was, if he was okay, but all he gave me were cryptic instructions. Come alone. Bring a flashlight. Meet him at the old warehouse by the train tracks. I should have said no. Every part of me screamed not to go. But Nick wasn't just anyone. He was my oldest friend. The kind of person who could call you after 5 years of silence and still feel like family. So I told him I'd come. Now here I was, standing in front of that crumbling, graffiti-covered building, its jagged silhouette cut against the cold December sky. The warehouse had been abandoned for years. It was the kind of place we used to dare each other to explore when we were kids, back when we thought ghosts were the scariest things in the world. Now, as I stood there staring at the gaping black doorway, I wished I could go back to being scared of things that weren't real. The door creaked open when I pushed it. The sound sliced through the silence like a scream. Inside, it was even colder than outside. The damp, bone-deep chill made my teeth ache. The air smelled stale, like wet concrete and mildew. But underneath it was something else. And something metallic and sharp, like copper. Blood. My voice echoed in the cavernous space, bouncing off rusted beams and broken machinery. Nothing. Just silence. The kind that felt too loud, like it was listening. I took a shaky step inside. My boots scuffed against the concrete floor. The flashlight beam wobbled in my hands, casting jagged shadows across the walls. Broken crates and tangled wires littered the floor. Every time the light hit something even vaguely human-shaped, my heart jumped into my throat. "Nick." I called again, louder this time. My voice cracked on the last syllable. Still no answer. And then I saw it. Just a smear on the floor, dark and shiny, like someone had spilled paint. But as I stepped closer, the smell hit me. The unmistakable, coppery tang of blood. My heart started pounding, the sound of it roaring in my ears as I followed the trail. Each step felt heavier than the last, like my boots were sinking into the concrete. The trail led to a crumpled figure, slumped against the far wall, right under a flickering industrial light. "Speak, Dick." His face was as pale as the snow outside, his chest rising and falling in short, ragged breaths. Blood soaked his shirt. The dark stains spread across his chest like an ink blot. "We need to make a stop. Lila," he whispered, his lips barely moving. His eyes fluttered open. His eyes fluttered open, just enough to see me. "You came." "Of course I came." "Ah," her said. Tears blurred my vision as I pressed my hands against the wound. "What the hell happened? Who did this to you?" He winced. His hand weakly grabbed my wrist. "Doesn't matter," he rasped. His voice was so faint I had to lean in to hear him. "You need to leave. They'll come back." "Who's coming back?" My voice cracked, panic rising in my chest. I shook him gently, trying to keep him awake. "Nick, stay with me. We'll get you out of here, okay? Just hang on." But he didn't. His head slumped to the side, and his hand slipped away from mine, falling limp against the cold concrete. For a moment, I just sat there, frozen. My hands were still pressed against his chest, as if I could will him back to life. Then, I heard it. A faint shuffling sound came from somewhere deeper in the warehouse. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, straining to listen. The flashlight beam darted toward the noise, but all it caught were the same shadows and piles of junk as before. "Hello?" I called out. My voice trembled. Silence. And then, a laugh, low and guttural. It echoed through the space, sending a chill straight down my spine. It wasn't Nick. It wasn't anyone I knew. The laugh grew louder, bouncing off the walls until it was impossible to tell where it was coming from. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The flashlight flickered. "Stay," he said with a whisper in his ear. And stay. For a split second, I saw them. A figure, tall and hunched, their face hidden behind a mask that glinted in the faint light. In their hand, they held something long and sharp. Even though I couldn't see their eyes, I could feel them watching me. The flashlight went out. I didn't think. I just ran. My boots slipped on the blood-slick floor, my hands scrambling for the walls to guide me as I bolted for the door. Behind me, the laughter turned into heavy, deliberate footsteps, each one louder than the last. My chest burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't dare stop. I hit the door with all my weight, bursting out into the freezing night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I barely felt it. I just kept running. My footsteps echoed in the empty streets until I reached the main road. The Christmas lights blinked on and off, oblivious. The faint sound of carolers drifted from a nearby cafe, like the world was still spinning normally, like everything hadn't just fallen apart. I collapsed onto a bench. The tinkling bell sounds receded through the night, silently, as if waiting for an order. It felt like relief. My hands shook so hard I could barely breathe. My palms were still sticky with Nick's blood. The smell of it clung to me. "Lee!" People walked by, their faces blurring together, none of them stopping to ask if I was okay. Nick's body was found the next morning. The police said it was gang violence, another tragic statistic in a part of town no one cared about. They never found the masked figure. I never told them what I saw. Every Christmas, since I think about that night, about Nick, about the laughter that still haunts my dreams. Christmas is supposed to be a time for joy, for family, for hope. But for me, it'll always be the night I learn that some monsters don't hide in the shadows. They walk among us, and sometimes they wear masks. Christmas Eve, it's supposed to be magical, right? The lights, the music, the warmth of family waiting at home. But that night, it felt like anything but. I'd spent the whole day in the city, drowning in a sea of last-minute shoppers, pushing through crowds so thick you couldn't take 2 steps without bumping into someone. My arms ached from carrying more bags than I could count, half filled with gifts from my son, The other half, with random groceries, I'd forgotten until the very last second. By the time I got off the bus that evening, I was completely spent. All I wanted was to be home, in my cozy little apartment, with my boys snuggled up beside me while we watched a cheesy Christmas movie. That's all. Just one peaceful night. The air hit me the second I stepped down from the bus. That sharp, biting cold almost felt personal, like it was out to get you. My breath billowed in front of me in little clouds as I adjusted my scarf, tugged my coat tighter, and started the walk home. The snow on the ground was more like a dusting than a blanket, but it sparkled under the streetlights, each flake catching the light like glitter. Normally, I'd have appreciated it, taken a moment to let the beauty of it all sink in. But that night, I was too tired to notice much of anything. My focus was on getting home, dropping the bags, and collapsing on the couch. The route to my apartment wasn't long, but it had this little shortcut I always took. It was a narrow lane squeezed between rows of old brick buildings, and it always felt kind of charming, especially at Christmas. The lights people hung from their windows would sag a little in places, like they'd been put up half-heartedly. But they gave the street this warm, lived-in feeling. When it snowed, it was like stepping into one of those Christmas village displays, the kind people set up with tiny ceramic houses and fake snow. But that night, it didn't feel charming. It felt different. The kind of quiet that makes you notice how loud your own footsteps sound, or how the cold seems to press down harder, sharper. I told myself I was just tired, that I was reading into things too much. Still, I quickened my pace, shifting the bags in my hands and fixing my eyes on the end of the block where the lane opened into the parking lot of my building, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, not mine. I'm not the paranoid type, not usually, so we have to watch. I'm used to walking home alone, even late at night, but something about those footsteps sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I glanced back, trying to make it look casual, like I was just checking the time on my phone or something. There was a man, not far behind me, tall, broad shoulders, bundled up in a heavy coat, with a knit hat pulled low. I couldn't see his face, not clearly anyway, but he was close enough that I could tell he wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't rushing to get home. He was just there. I told myself it was fine. It was Christmas Eve. Plenty of people were out and about, probably on their way home from parties or family gatherings. I tried to quiet the noise in my head. Maybe he'd just finished some last-minute shopping too, but then I noticed something. His pace wasn't random. It wasn't just a coincidence. Every time I sped up, so did he. When I slowed down, his steps matched mine. It wasn't accidental. He was following me. By the time I reached the end of the block, my heart was pounding in my chest. My building was right there, so close I could see the soft glow of the lobby lights spilling out onto the snow. I was so focused on getting there that I almost didn't hear him call out, "Merry Christmas." I froze. The words weren't cheerful, not like you'd expect. They were sharp, almost mocking, like he knew something I didn't. I turned slowly, gripping the shopping bags tighter than I realized. He was standing under one of the street lights now, just far enough away that I could finally make out his face. It wasn't the face of someone you'd want to run into on a dark street. His skin was pale, stretched too tight over sharp cheekbones. He faced me silently, casting only a fraction of a glance along his long prong, protruding nose. His grin got that grin. It was wide and wrong, teeth yellowed and jagged like he'd been chewing on glass, but his eyes were the worst. They were cold, empty, like there wasn't a single human thing left behind them. In his hand, glinting under the light, was a jagged piece of metal. It wasn't a proper knife, more like a shard of something broken, but the edge looked sharp enough to do plenty of damage. "Got any Christmas spirit to spare?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he took a step closer. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out, but I forced myself to stand still. I couldn't run, not with the bags weighing me down, and I knew he'd catch me before I made it to the lobby. I had to think, fast. "You don't want to do this," I said. "Walk away now. Just go." For a second, he looked surprised, like he wasn't expecting me to talk back. Then, his grin widened, and he let out this low, guttural laugh that made my skin crawl. "Walk away?" he said. Standing inside the lift surpassed pulling his bowels out. I turned to Mike. "Nah, sweetheart. I think we're just getting started." It happened so fast that I barely had time to react. My hands let go of the bags instinctively, the weight dropping to the ground with a dull thud. My fingers scrambled for the pocket of my coat, closing around the folding knife I'd started carrying after one too many late-night shifts at work. Little at little, at little, at little. It wasn't big, but it was sharp. I snapped it open with a flick of my wrist, holding it out in front of me, like my life depended on it. "To come any closer," I said, "and I swear you'll regret it." For a moment, everything seemed to stop. He froze, his eyes narrowing as he took in the knife. I could see the gears turning in his head, the way he was weighing his options. He hadn't expected this. He thought I'd be an easy target. For a few agonizing seconds, we just stood there, locked in some kind of twisted standoff. Then finally, he took a step back. "You're lucky it's Christmas," he muttered, stuffing the shard of metal into his pocket. But he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he'd appeared. I didn't move for what felt like forever. My breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the knife. When I finally managed to shove it back into my pocket, I grabbed my bags and stumbled toward the lobby, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I got inside, the warmth of the building hit me like a wave. For the first time, I realized how cold I was. My son came running the moment I opened the door, his little face lighting up with that pure, unfiltered joy only kids seem to have. I dropped the bags and pulled him into the biggest hug I could manage. "Mama, you're squishing me," he giggled. "Sorry, baby," I whispered. "I just missed you." That night we sat by the Christmas tree, unwrapping gifts and watching the lights twinkle. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that man, his grin, his eyes, the way his voice cut through the air like a blade. I don't think I'll ever forget it. I still carry that knife with me every day, not because I want to, but because now I know you never think something like that will happen to you. Until it does. Let me tell you, I'll never hear Merry Christmas the same way again. The hum of the engine rumbled beneath me, steady and low, the kind of sound that settled in your bones if you let it. I sat there, at the edge of town, my hands wrapped tight around the steering wheel. The cracked leather was familiar under my palms. The sky was heavy with clouds, threatening snow. But the streets were still dry and deserted. The rain began, ran long and hard, then showered and melted away. It was Christmas Eve, A night meant for warmth, joy, family. But for me, it was none of those things. My name's Rachel Carter. This is the story of how I disappeared. That day had been like any other, or at least I told myself it was. I worked the closing shift at Harper's Market. It was rather empty. There weren't any customers, but I took meals. Essie. I flipped the close sign with a practice motion. The little jingle of the door's bell rang out into the cold night air. The parking lot was bathed in a tired orange glow from the streetlights. After I expected at a halt, the driver opened the door. "Oh, sorry," he said. "Why are you alone?" The bulbs flickered like they were trying to decide whether to give up completely. Somewhere in the distance I could hear faint singing, carolers maybe. Their voices rose and fell. She valleys the energy enough to hear, but for the both of them, they were not quite flat enough to hear music. Instead of feeling festive, it sounded lonely, almost haunting. As I locked the store door, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Victor, again. Rua commanded evenly. His name lit up the screen like a bad omen. My stomach nodded. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Victor had a way of dragging me into his storms, even when I swore I'd stay clear of them. Instead, I pulled up a different number. Bridgers. Pause. My thumb hovered for a second before I hit call. "Yeah?" he answered after a few rings. His voice was short, like he'd been expecting the call but hadn't wanted it. "You still coming?" I asked. I kept my voice steady, even though my chest felt tight. 5 minutes, he said, already sounding impatient. "Same spot?" "Same spot," I confirmed, and hung up. Paul. He was another one of those complicated chapters in my life, the kind you don't really want to read aloud, but also can't seem to tear out. He wasn't mine. Married, older, a professional at making promises that melted like snow in the sun. But he'd been there when I had no one else. Somehow that was enough. He helped me get an apartment when things with Victor had crumbled into something ugly. In return, I let him carve out pieces of me I wasn't sure I'd ever get back. Tonight, though, I wasn't thinking about all that. Tonight, I just needed a ride. I stepped onto the lone street.